BTD6 just got a new tower. And that's something that I thought would never happen at this rate. I know that might sound stupid, what do you mean? Of course the game's going to keep getting new towers. But the thing is, this is technically the first new tower we've ever gotten in the entire history of BTD6, no joke. This game is nearly 5 years old now, and we have never gotten a new tower over the entire lifespan of this game. The only towers that have been added to the game are old BTD5 towers that didn't get ported over, getting ported over. Which, yes, does include new upgrades, but ultimately it's the same tower, and a lot of the upgrades are just copy-paste. This was the case for the Mortar, the Engineer, and the Dartling. And those were the only towers, quote-unquote, added to BTD6 in its entire lifespan. That combined with the fact that it seemed like a lot of the more recent updates leaned very heavily on finding ways to add new content without adding new towers, really convinced me they just weren't going to add any more towers. I mean, when you think about it, the invention of paragons almost seems like a way to avoid making new towers. It's a way to give already existing towers just one new upgrade, but pack so much into it, it kinda feels like a new tower. Heroes I felt the same about. Obviously, heroes are cool and all, but they're not as good as a new tower. You don't get to actually choose different upgrade paths. And yet, we've got quite a few heroes added to the game at this rate, so considering that most of the more recent updates have just been paragons, heroes, I genuinely did not think a new tower was ever going to be added to the game. Even little things like the hotkeys, where there isn't enough room to fit a hotkey for this extra monkey. And things like Battles 2 being announced just shortly after they'd already added the Dartling gun to the game, kind of implying that's the last tower they're going to add, and they were waiting to announce Battles 2 until they'd added their quote-unquote last tower. I was thoroughly convinced that a new tower was just not going to be added to BTD6. I really thought that the rest of BTD6's life would just be getting one more hero to fill that last hero slot, and then all the paragons we don't have yet, and then BTD7 comes out however many years in the future. So yeah, needless to say, I think this update is pretty goddamn huge. And I'm sorry if this is the first video you're seeing on this tower and you don't know what it does yet, because I haven't talked about it much yet, and that's just because, well, there's a lot of other people out there who have made earlier content than I have, so this video is more just talking about, well, how I use it in this CHIMPS run and what I think of the tower. But the short version of what this tower does is, well, as you can imagine, it trains beasts. Every upgrade path is a different beast. One land-based, one water-based, one sky-based. You got sharks, raptors, and eagles. And this tower, as you might have already been able to tell, is one of the most unique towers we've seen so far in the game's lifespan. Unupgraded, it does almost nothing. It has very tiny range, and all it does is poke things with its little staff thing. But once you start getting some upgrades, obviously you'll be able to control beasts. All the beasts except for the birds have very short range, but you can place them anywhere you can inside the larger sort of circle around the beast handler. The smaller circles for the range of their poking stick. As well as that, the beast handler can have up to 2 different beast actives at once, since, you know, every upgrade path is a different beast, although only one of those beasts will be able to be truly very strong. The big gimmick with the beast handler, though, is that every single one of his upgrades can be empowered by merging more beast handlers together. And I'm not gonna lie, I'm kind of surprised to see this gimmick. I know this was leaked in the past, back when this character was supposed to come out about 3 months ago and they got delayed. But when I heard about this being the mechanic behind him, I assumed the delay was them ditching that mechanic, because this mechanic sounded like it might be overcomplicated or just a bad idea in general. And to be fair, I don't love it per se. I do have some problems with this mechanic, but I can't deny it's something very different and it does work better than I expected it would. As well as that, I'm a little embarrassed to admit that it took me about 5 full games of using this beast handler to realize that once I merged multiple beast handlers together, that one beast handler using all the combined beast handlers' power could place their beast anywhere within the combined range of the multiple beast handlers that they are connected to, allowing you to place your beast in so many more different areas. This is why the background footage right now is footage of me beating Bloonarius Prime on CHIMPS, because it's a pretty good example of how the beast handler can be used. Since this is a map which essentially has 2 completely different lanes, both of which have water on them, and I personally think that the top path is the strongest path for the beast handler at the moment, it only makes sense for me to get some really strong beast handlers that can at will swap their orca from swimming on the right side to swimming on the left side every single time the side the balloons are coming from changes. However, there is one big problem with this tower if you're not already aware of this. This tower cannot receive an alchemist buff. And I've got to admit, I have no idea why. You might think at first, oh yeah, that makes sense because it's the beast that attacks, not the beast handler. But you can overclock it, and you can give it village buffs. It seems to be that every other buff in the game works, it's just AMD and Berserker Brood doesn't. And that really holds this tower back. Alchemists run this game. Although I suppose you're supposed to substitute the lack of having an alchemist with the ability to obviously empower beast handlers by combining them. That being said, for this reason, I think that Jungle Drums is basically a must on beast handlers. It may be a simple upgrade, but if you have a tower that can have extremely high power packed into it, but can't really receive that much in the way of buffs, and Jungle Drums is one of the only good buffs it can receive, it's absolutely worth it. I would say the same for Overclock, however, I'm not entirely sure how overclock works with this tower. There have been some times in which it's clearly working and I'm getting an enormous amount of increased damage from the overclock, and sometimes where it doesn't seem to do much. Now I think this is down to the Orca specifically, since it has the ability to sort of pseudo insta-kill, kind of like a boat pull, to a lot of Moabs. I think that it might be that the overclock doesn't allow you to insta-kill faster, but technically your normal DPS with the Orca is faster. I think that might be the problem, but I'm not entirely certain. That being said, for the towers for which the overclock does work, overclock is also very good on beast handlers. Now I know that might sound obvious, overclock's good on everything, right? But I actually think that overclock might be better on beast handlers than on any other tower in the game. Sounds a bit strange, but hear me out. Not only is it the fact that you can't outbuff them, so the overclock becomes more valuable because, you know, there are less good buffs you can put on it, but more importantly, I recently learned something. I missed a balance patch where they reworked the way overclock works. If you didn't know, the way overclock used to work would be that the more expensive your tower was, the less time the overclock would last for. And I always thought that was still how it worked. However, I didn't realize there was a balance patch I missed at some point where they changed it once again, so that instead, it depends on what tier the tower is upgraded to. So now, regardless of how cheap or expensive it is, tier 5s receive the least uptime and tier 4s receive enough uptime so that as long as you reapply it the second it turns off, you can have 100% overclock uptime on one tower, as long as that tower's a tier 4. So obviously once I learned this, I went to test this out in a game, and this is before the Beast Handler came out, a couple days before. I went to look at what some of the more expensive tier 4s were in the game that before might not have gotten the full overclock benefit, but now do. And unfortunately, the only one that really was crazy is of course the Temple, but I don't think I want to count the Temple or the Dark Knight, considering that both of them are so expensive you'll never get them in a real game of chimps. So instead I looked towards the more reasonably priced ones. And the main ones I noticed were the Spectre, the Tech Terror, and the Apache. However, with the addition of the Beast Handler, well, the Beast Handler's tier 4s for the most part are also pretty damn expensive and pretty damn powerful. And as well as that, you're not just buying one tier 4 tower, you're buying one tier 4 tower and then maybe combining 3 other tier 4 towers into that tier 4 tower to make it even stronger, but it's still considered a tier 4 tower, so if you overclock it, you won't get the penalty, even if you're putting enough money to buy a tier 5 into this tier 4. And that could make it too expensive to be viable in chimps if it weren't for the fact that, once again, here it's a lot better because you're not buying it all in bulk at once. You're not saving up 60,000 to buy an upgrade and then spending it all at once. Instead, you're doing it in increments of 16,000 or so, getting every tier 4, which makes it far more manageable to reach those price thresholds. Again, it doesn't seem to work perfectly on the Orca because of the way the insta-kill mechanics seem to interfere with overclock and overall make it not act that much faster. But in terms of pure DPS, yeah, it definitely seems like overclock is very, very good on the Beast Handler. Now that said, what do I think of the upgrade paths? Well, I think I gave the game away already earlier, but just in case I don't remember what I said correctly, yeah, top path is the best path. Obviously, I'm literally going off of I've played it for like 3 hours and I've made my decision based off of that because I want to get this video out very quickly, but I feel pretty confident in saying that already. I hate to say it as well, because this is the one I was the most interested in going in, but I think the worst path has to be the bird path as well. So let me explain. By the tier 3 upgrade, at which point the fish that you control turn into a shark, you're able to pop leads with the top path. Although you can't see camo, you need to get a camo village for that. But more importantly, when this shark jumps onto something, it will deal a constant, insanely fast damage over time until it's popped. And as you can tell, the main weakness of this is just the time it takes for it to sink back into the ocean and then jump back out again. That is the main thing that can sometimes catch this thing out if when it first jumps out, it misses an important target, and before it can jump out again to catch what it missed, it's already gone past. But as long as that doesn't happen, the DPS of this tower is absolutely insane for the cost. which is probably somewhat intentional considering, of course, water-based towers always seem to get a little bit of favoritism since not all maps have water in the best of spots. Unfortunately, and I'm really sad to see this, it doesn't seem like a water-based beast handler counts as a water tower, which is unfortunate because it means you don't get the carrier flagship buff, and it also means that I don't think it gets any of the benefits of the sparkling water in the brand new intermediate map, which, if you didn't know, that sparkling water provides discounts, increased attack speed, and camo detection to anything in the water, at the cost of the fact the water gets covered at every single round that ends in 6. At which point you have to pay to get your towers back, and the cost increases every time it happens. The 4th tier upgrade is where things get crazy though, because it allows you to insta-kill large groups of up to BFBs just with every single leap. It's not even an ability like the Pirate or anything, it's just every single time that Orca jumps out the water, it takes out multiple BFBs and mobs with it. It's practically just a death plane, any balloon that touches it just dies. And what's better is you don't even need to buy the 5th tier to get this to work on Zongs too. All you need to do is max out its power by combining other beast handlers into it, and it will also be able to insta-kill Zongs with this ability. At which point you have a single tier 4, which is able to basically solo every round in the game if given camo detection and enough support, except the final round, round 100. Which even then, actually, it can solo 100, even though it doesn't insta-kill the bad. The DPS of the Orca is so high that it just melts it anyway, and then it kills everything inside it. So yeah, needless to say, the top path is looking good. If anything, I'm a little bit worried that the top path might get nerfed. I know nerfs aren't very common overall in BTD. We usually get buffs instead. It's usually whatever's weaker gets buffed rather than whatever's strong gets nerfed. But with how insane the DPS of this tower is, I would not be surprised if this thing was on the chopping block for nerfs. That being said, a little bit disappointed to say, I realize, but I gotta say, I feel like the other two paths, if anything, are kind of underwhelming. The Raptor middle path is really bad to start, but gets better as it goes. Essentially, all it is really is a bunch of upgrades which allow you to do really high damage, really high pierce, like constant DPS, but only in a very small area right next to the Raptor. And obviously by the 4th tier, it turns into a dinosaur, which is able to stomp as an ability to stun balloons around it, which I'll admit is actually a pretty good ability, because it has a pretty fast cooldown, and the stun is effective even on Moabs. The bottom path was the first path I went for in my first games gathering experience for the beast handler, and it summoned a bird. And this bird, unlike the other two beasts, can attack anywhere on the track that the beast handler can see, rather than having to be replaced. You're probably going to be pretty confused by the targeting marker for the bird. That's not actually for where the bird attacks, that's strangely enough for where it does its sort of quote-unquote special attack. You see, sometimes it just hits the balloons normally, but whenever it's close to wherever you've targeted the bird, it will instead grab the balloons and physically pull them backwards. The birds are also the only upgrades that the beast handler has access to which allow them to see camo. Well, not them to see camo per se, only the bird can see camo. And that's the problem actually. Not only do you actually have to get it up to 2nd tier before it can see camo, so it's not particularly cheap camo detection, but on top of that, these birds are pretty awful DPS. Not so bad necessarily if they have support alongside them, I suppose, but just frankly they don't do a lot of damage. They're mostly good against single annoying targets, since they deal multiple layers of damage and are quite slow to attack, but have a lot of range and usually do multiple layers of damage. But even then, they get overwhelmed very quickly and are very inconsistent. Even just tanks get past them. And while the knockback is appreciated, in my experience it seems to be really inconsistent. Every now and then it'll be really strong, but every now and then it will do the opposite and, if anything, be very underwhelming and let things through. And I can't really see a consistent pattern. It just seems like it's almost random whether it will actually slow the mobs down or barely do anything at all. In fact, in some cases, and in fairness, I imagine this is a bug that will be fixed, I've actually seen the birds drag mobs forward by accident, simply because the hitboxes of Zongs are so big that I've seen them grab a Zong when they're not supposed to be close enough to be grabbed yet, and try to pull them back. But when they place them down on the track, they've actually placed them down further forward than they were originally, just because they shouldn't have been grabbed in the first place from the distance they were at, and it was because it was too far away, but again, the hitboxes of Zongs are just that big. I will say there is one saving grace for the bottom path though, and that is that it is the only affordable 5th tier upgrade this tower has access to, since it costs only about 30,000. And I haven't really played enough to get a good opinion on this 5th tier upgrade, but so far it seems okay. And although that might not sound very enthusiastic, I do think that's the best we're gonna get. Because, again, I hate to be a bit of a downer, but There is a consistent theme usually whenever new towers are added to BTD6. I've noticed that almost all the time when new towers are added, there's a couple things that happen. First of all, usually, with the exception of the Alchemist, towers are usually more underpowered than overpowered when first released. There's a lot of power creep in BTD6, which I'm going to make it clear, power creep isn't necessarily a bad thing at all times. I know it's usually used as a big boogeyman, but essentially it's just this fact that any game that has a meta, typically if new content keeps getting added to the game, regardless of whether they try to make that content stronger or not, eventually the base power level that everything else has to match up to just goes up over time. And I actually think that depending on the amount of power creep in a vacuum can be a good thing for a game. You don't want the old content to be the best strategy forever. And while you certainly shouldn't make whatever the new content is always overpowered to the point where it feels like there's no point in really learning what's good in the game, because the second you figure out what's good, now the new things have come out and all the old things are underpowered again, obviously a reasonable level of power creep I actually think is kind of healthy for a game. That being said, it does seem like the way the BTD6 devs work usually is to release towers underpowered and then buff them up to balanced. And they are especially bad with this when it comes to 5th tiers. There are some 5th tiers in this game that have received price reductions of probably more than 50,000 at this rate. Almost every 5th tier in the game has gotten cheaper the longer the game's gone on, and so I was kind of expecting that the second new tower came out, all its 5th tiers would be way too expensive. And to be fair, they've gotten better. These aren't stupidly, ridiculously overpriced. And remember, these are medium difficulty prices. It's going to cost more than this in CHIMPS. As I mentioned, the bottom path is the cheapest one at about 30,000. The top path is 55,000, so you're looking at 60,000 basically for, CHIMPS difficulty. And the middle path is, I think it was, I just realized I don't remember off the top of my head, but it was either 70,000 or 80,000. It's probably 80,000 on hard difficulty. So to address the elephant in the room, no pun intended, you might be thinking, okay, don't get me wrong, that's not cheap, but is it that bad? Again, upgrades like Superstorm used to be basically 100,000 when the game first came out. And I know that Superstorm is still a garbage upgrade, but obviously it's a lot cheaper now. And when you compare prices like 100,000 to prices like 55,000 and prices like 70, 80,000, it's like, okay, well, obviously it's bad, but come on, it's not that bad. But here's the catch. I haven't mentioned yet that there's a gimmick to 5th tiers when it comes to these things. You know how you have to combine them together to get their true power or whatever? When it comes to 5th tiers, you're not allowed to buy the 5th tier until you combine 4 4th tier versions of the previous upgrade together. This massively increases the effective cost of every 5th tier for this tower, unnecessarily, and honestly, in my opinion. I'm not a fan of this mechanic. I get what they're going for, but I really hate it, I'm not gonna lie. I hate it because it makes a lot of these 5th tiers way less affordable than they should be. Again, I think the bottom path one will still be relatively affordable, even though when you take into account the 4th tiers you're going to have to buy to unlock it, it is going to cost something like, I don't know, 70,000? Just off the top of my head, I think something like that. I at least think it's going to be more affordable because, again, the hard part about buying these super expensive towers in CHIMPS mode isn't just affording them, but being able to survive when you have 60,000 cash that you're sat on not spending. In this case, you would be spending that cash just on towers that are later going to be converted into the 5th tier. So I do think, since you would only have to save up about 30,000 at once, that the bottom tier one might be more feasible. And I was hoping, I wasn't sure, I knew it'd be close, I was hoping that the 5th tier for the top path would just barely be affordable in CHIMPS mode, assuming that you didn't have to buy much defense. Unfortunately, I'll give the game away here if the footage hasn't already gotten to this point. I do not manage to afford the 5th tier for this tower. Once I get to the later rounds, I realize that I need more things on the map, and as soon as I buy these things, I'm just simply not going to have enough money for the Megalodon. Already, the 50 to 60,000 price threshold is where things start to get sketchy for CHIMPS. If something's under 50k, there's a pretty decent chance you'll be able to afford it in a CHIMPS run. If something's over 50k, that's where it starts getting really sketchy. And if something's over 80k, that's where things start getting, this isn't even possible. And a reminder that every single Orca you buy costs about 20,000 in total. So you're not actually paying 50,000 for this upgrade, or 60,000 again because hard mode. You're paying more you're paying more 120,000. About the amount you'd have to pay for a Super Mines. And again, this isn't even the most expensive one. And again, I've mentioned this in previous videos, but in case you are unaware, an important bit of knowledge to help put this on perspective is bearing in mind that you can't make any money in Chimps mode, that means that you always make the same amount of money in a game of Chimps by the end every time. And the amount of money that you make over the course of a full game of Chimps is somewhere around 210,000. And a reminder that a good quarter of that is all money that are going to be made in the last 10-20 rounds of the game. So basically, you got to beat the vast majority of the game with a budget of about 150k in mind. And yes, you will get a little bit more than that, but anything more than that you get will be gotten so late that it probably won't be able to save you unless it's something you only need for the last couple rounds. Keeping in mind that budget of about 150k, you can understand how sinking 120k into one single tower that also needs camo detection on top of that, yeah, it's kind of a lot to ask. Now, all that being said, I want to make it clear that I do not think the Megalodon is actually a bad 5th tier. I actually think, if anything, from what I've seen of it, it might be one of the most insane 5th tiers I've seen in this game, in theory. I remember thinking once I realized when the Orca was fully powered up, it could insta-kill Zongs. Well, where do you go from there? I mean, they're not going to have an ability that lets you insta-kill bads, right?
Hey, bro. What?
Oh my god!
So yeah, the Megalodon is able to insta-kill bads. It's not even a Paragon, it's just a 5th tier. Okay. So in fairness, it's HP based, not simply if it's a bad, it gets insta-killed. Which means that if it is like a fortified bad with ramping or whatever, it won't insta-kill it. It will have to keep dealing normal damage to it until it's in insta-kill range, and then it will do the insta-kill on it. That being said, that isn't relevant for Chimps mode. So as far as Chimps mode is concerned, yeah, I'm pretty confident the Megalodon is going to be able to solo maps on Chimps as long as you just give it camo detection somehow, and it's going to be an absolute beast. The only problem is, again, getting it. Now, maybe it'll turn out that people find good strategy to do this, but I imagine on most of the harder maps to do Chimps on, it's just simply not going to be viable. I just think you're probably going to have to spend too much on early game defense, and then as well as that, when you're about to afford it, you're going to have to deal with DDTs, and they're probably going to sneak by a little bit too quickly, so you need to start getting some slows for the DDTs, which then starts costing a lot more, and by the time you spent all this money, you probably will not be able to get the Megalodon in time. That being said, if people do find ways to make extremely cheap defenses in Chimps mode for certain maps that would otherwise be very difficult, that have water in enough places for the Megalodon to be good, then it could be amazing in theory. Especially when you look at maps like Bloody Puddles, it could be really interesting what will happen there. Considering that using multiple beast handlers, you can micro your Megalodon to move between every single puddle. I don't have anywhere near as much to say about the middle path 5th tier, just because I must admit I haven't used it much. And the reason for that is simply because it's not going to be relevant. Like, if Megalodon is one that we can barely afford in Chimps if everything goes perfectly, and even then, like, I'm not even sure if you could afford to fully power it up, then one that costs an extra 20k or so is definitely going to be too expensive for Chimps. And of course, I'm mostly interested in that. But hey, who knows, maybe it'll be really good in boss fights or something. Anyway, you might notice here that I went into free play a bit ago so that I could keep playing this run. That was to see if I could eventually afford the Megalodon in this run, even if it had to be in quick play just for the sake of showing it off, but unfortunately not. That being said, I wouldn't be very surprised if the very next update the game gets, we're instantly getting price decreases to some of these 5th tiers. Again, it seems like it's just a habit of theirs that whenever a new tower comes out, the 5th tiers are always overpriced. It doesn't mean that the Beast Handler isn't useful, of course. I still think that the Beast Handler is going to be insanely good for the top path, even if you don't get it to 5th tier, just with Orcas on their own. I mean, they were basically our main DPS for this entire map, and they seem to do completely fine in Chimps mode. And I know this map is considered intermediate, but I definitely consider this one of the harder intermediate maps. And as well as that, I'm interested to see if Beast Handlers see much use in openings for Chimps, as in like the early game. I originally thought not, because it seems like the pure DPS of Beast Handlers isn't that great, at least not until you get them more further upgraded. But it might be more than I think, considering that, first of all, you can micro them, and I haven't really been doing that much, because obviously, again, I'm kind of first impressions here. And second of all, merging them together to give them combined ranges could make them really good on, again, maps like Bloody Puddles and Muddy Puddles, where there's so many different lanes that each could have different towers on them. And then instead of having to get different defenses for every lane, you could simply create a chain of Beast Handlers all combined into one extremely powerful tower that you can simply move to each lane as the rounds on those lanes occur. So I do think that the Beast Handler might see some more use on expert maps compared to easier maps. Anyway, with all that said, thanks for watching, and I'm hoping you're enjoying the new update. See you in the next one. Bye.